The Sega Saturn, a system which people perpetually talk about due to its apparent abundance of fantastic games that were only released in Japan. Ironically, as much as most people talk about this, people seem to rarely often talk about the actual fantastic titles in question. It is as if the Japanese Saturn's library quality is simply a factoid people know about and believe. However, not many people in the West seem to have had the pleasure of experiencing it. So, as a matter of service, and as a duty to the people, my loyal fans, I have spent a great deal of time exploring the Japanese Saturn's library. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I can finally present to you my top 50 Japanese Sega Saturn exclusives. It is finally time to see in detail what all the hype is about. But before we get this list underway, I just want to say that there are no games on this list that are not playable if you are English speaking only. So I will not be featuring any big RPGs that are yet to get a fan translation. So with these rough rules in place, here are my top 50 Japanese Saturn games. Yeah! I just mentioned that most Japanese Saturn games get rarely talked about. So let's start this video off by contradicting myself with Radiant Silvergun. This is the one Japanese Saturn game that every man and his dog is familiar with, and due to this, import and procurement costs on this title continue to go through the roof. This 1998 shooter, developed by the world-renowned Treasure of Gunstar Heroes fame, originally appeared in the arcades, but was artfully ported over to the Saturn. Many people feel this game is so good that it is responsible for a renaissance in the shoot 'em up genre. This game will go down in history as one of the greatest of all time due to the title's beautiful parallax backdrops, Mode 7 style distortion effects, and wonderful use of 3D polygons. As much as people love Radiant Silvergun, personally I think this game is even better. Tsukyu Garante, also known as TERRA Diver, is another fantastic shooter ported from the arcade to the Saturn. This game, developed by Raisin, made an appearance on the Saturn in 1997. This is another amazing vertical scrolling shooter, featuring everything you could possibly want from a game within this genre. Once again, like Radiant Silvergun, the game is unusual in that rather than using a 3:4 aspect ratio to better suit the vertically orientated gameplay, it opts for a 4:3 horizontal orientation in the style of a Neo Geo vertical shooter. Everyone has heard of the fantastic Saturn Bomberman, but not so many people are familiar with Saturn Bomberman Fight. Unlike the previous Saturn Bomberman, this 1997 title features 3D polygons. The game is experienced from an isometric viewpoint and features a total of 14 playable characters. The game includes a story mode, training mode, battle mode and survival mode, and Western journalists at the time were disappointed that this was not released in other regions, yet we still got an inferior Bomberman 64 anyway. Goiken Moyu, Anarchy in Nippon, is a decent little underappreciated fighter for the Sega Saturn. The game plays very similar to Virtua Fighter 2, but takes a much more light-hearted approach. Interestingly, it is said that the game was worked on by the same team as Virtua Fighter 2 as well, and was pitched to Sega to be published by the company. This was never to be though, and instead was published by KSS in late 1997. Bulk Slash is a visually striking third-person shooter published on the Saturn by Hudson Soft in 1997. The gameplay is heaps of fun and easy to get to grips with. Within this game, you control a mech which can be switched and transformed at will between a jet fighter and a walking robot. In robot form, you can cut enemies to pieces using your slash attack, as well as jump and shoot. In this game, you make your way through action-orientated missions in bright, colourful, unique environments. Another fine addition to the Saturn's library. Let's talk about another genre the Sega Saturn is renowned for: 2D fighting games. Street Fighter 03 never saw a release on the platform outside of Japan, and for a good while was considered the ultimate home port of the popular arcade game. 03, known as Alpha 3 in the West, introduced the guard power gauge to the franchise that depletes every time the player blocks, bringing a new gameplay element to the series. Many would consider this game to be near arcade perfect. Cotton Boomerang is somewhat of a remix of Cotton 2, another great game for the Saturn, but too similar to feature both games on this list. This is a cutesy 1998 vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, developed and published by Success. The stunning game features detailed backdrops, interesting enemies and huge boss battles, all in all bringing a welcome change of pace from the many other shooters available on the system. We all know of Sega Rally and Daytona USA on the system, but people often neglect to talk about Shutokou Battle 97 Drift King. This is from a franchise that would later in the West go on to be known as Tokyo Extreme Racer. The series is based on illegal highway racing on the Shuto Expressway Bayshore route in Tokyo with custom tuned cars. This was a common occurrence at the time of the series debut. Again, all in all, this game is pretty underrated on the platform. Bubble Symphony, also known as Bubble Bobble 2, is a wonderful entry within the Bubble Bobble series, in which can be experienced on the Saturn. In this title game, you can take branching routes through levels by selecting different doors at the end of stages, giving you a varied play experience on multiple playthroughs. There are also boss battles every 5 to 10 levels, charged bubble shots, and you can use the rainbows as weapons from Rainbow Islands. This is a fun, light-hearted arcade experience amongst many of the Saturn's more mature games. Hyperduel is a 1993 arcade shooter developed and published by Technosoft that made its way over to the Sega Saturn in 1996. The Saturn version contains a near arcade perfect arcade mode, along with an updated Saturn mode. The Saturn mode of the game is cleaner, brighter and offers more detailed sprites. Backgrounds are even redrawn in some cases. The game also features a fantastic soundtrack, which is so good it was released as an actual purchasable album in Japan. Magical Drop 3 is a puzzle game released in 1997. The game's premise is simple. A stack of random coloured bubbles descend from the top and the player is defeated when a bubble hits the bottom. Bubbles can be picked up and dropped by the player and are destroyed when 3 or more of the same colour are put together on a single column. Like many other great puzzle games, this title is addictive as hell. Elevator Action 2 Returns is a 1994 title that got ported to the platform in 1997. In this action platforming game, you must make your way down a series of lifts while simultaneously shooting your way through waves of enemies to survive. The objective of the game is to enter all of the red coloured doors in each stage, then proceed to the exit. There is a variety of creative ways you can inflict pain on your enemies, such as fighting them with melee weapons, shooting exploding oil drums, and most amusingly, crushing them under the weight of the elevators. Fun, fun, fun. Savaki, not to be confused with souvlaki, the tasty Greek snack, is another 3D fighter, this time developed by Sinus and published by Microcabin. This game appears to take place in a UFC-like octagon, as you play as a selection of different characters, each of which represent a different martial art or fighting skill. In fact, this 2D fighter seems to be solely based on mixing different martial arts, which, in my opinion, makes this title a lot trendier now than it would have been at the time of the game's release, so why not try it out for yourself? The King of Fighters 96 is a 2D fighter published by SNK, and is the third entry in the King of Fighters series. The game offers a large character roster and includes new techniques that did not appear in previous entries in the series. This title has strong playability and is a must-play for any fan of 2D sprite-based fighting games. Digital Pinball Necronomicon is a pinball title developed by Kays in 1996. The game has a fantastic look and feel to it, and the experience is all around satisfying. It is also of note that despite being a Japan exclusive, all the voices and text in the game are in English, so you cannot ask for more than that really when trying out a Japan exclusive as a Westerner. SHINREI JUSATSUSHI TAROMARU, a title I have zero chance of pronouncing right, is a side-scrolling action game developed and published by Time Warner Interactive in 1997. In this game you take control of a psychic ninja in feudal Japan, as you use your Palpatine-like powers to use force lightning to destroy your enemies. The game features great layered 2D and 3D effects and is all around a pleasure on the eyes. The game is full of impressive boss fights and innovative levels, and can be easily compared to some of the greats such as Shinobi and Castlevania. This is one of the rarest and most expensive Saturn games out there. The fantastic Thunder Force 5 saw a release on the Sega Saturn in Japan. This techno-soft side-scrolling shooter arrived on the platform in 1997 and is hailed as one of the best in the genre. The stage format has the same horizontally aligned orientation as the previous entry in the series, and many would consider this title to be a shooter fan's dream. TOUGE King the Spirit 2 is another great forgotten racer of Sega's past. This game, released by Atlus of all companies, is the sequel to a game released in America as High Velocity Mountain Racing Challenge. This entry in the series builds and improves on the system's predecessor in every way. You could make a strong case for this title topping the quality of both Sega Rally and Daytona USA. However, I will leave that part up to you to decide upon. Real Bout Fatal Fury Special made an appearance in Japan amongst the Sega Saturn's library in December of 1997. The game adds some additional characters to the roster in this special version of the game. Like many of the 2D fighters on the system, the title takes advantage of the 1MB RAM cartridge expansion in order to retain sprite animations, making it a great conversion of the game. Polyruler is a hilarious arcade scrolling beat 'em up, which I personally experienced on the FM Towns Marty. I personally think this version of the game runs slightly better than its Marty variant, and is a hell of a lot cheaper too. This game is as weird and Japanese as they come, and as you can probably see from the footage I'm showing you now, so much oddness is going on because, well, Japan I suppose. Whilst Shining Force 3 is a standalone title in the West, in Japan the game has two sequels. The first of these is known as Shining Force 3 Scenario 2, and up until fairly recently this game was not accessible to Westerners due to the fact it is very text heavy. Thankfully, a fan translation of this title now exists, which you can play using your Saturn hardware. In this strategy role-playing game, you can play through the same story as its predecessor, only this time from the perspective of a different group of warriors. Think of this as a similar thing to what happened in the 3 Fire Emblem Fate games, which were on the 3DS, only this was made 20 years earlier. Innovative stuff! Blast Wind is yet another great shooter published on the Sega Saturn by Technosoft. It is of note that no arcade version of this game exists, despite the fact that it looks very arcadey. This is because the arcade version of the title was unfortunately cancelled. This game is generally just more Japanesey shooty fun, amongst a plethora of great games like this on the system. Super Tempo, released in 1998, is the sequel to Tempo, released on the Sega 32X. I would not go as far as to claim this game is anything particularly special, but the game's bright colours, 2D platforming and rhythm sections just about inch this game into the fray. It is of note that the game was developed by Sakurai Tyson, the creator of Bonk. I guess this was one of the latest 2D mascot platformers, before this genre almost completely disappeared for a while. Konami Antiques MSX Collection Ultra Pack is a selection of MSX microcomputer games all located on one Sega Saturn disc. The novelty of this disc alone, in my opinion, makes this one particularly interesting, and it is cool to play these old titles using 32-bit hardware. The discs give you a retro in retro experience, which I love, especially when you take into account that MSX computers were practically non-existent in my country. This has been my first experience with many of these games. Castlevania Symphony of the Night made an appearance on the Sega Saturn in Japan. This version of the game differs from its PlayStation counterpart, as you can play as a girl in this one as opposed to just Richter Belmont and Alucard, bringing some welcome changes to the well-known title. Sadly though, the PlayStation version is probably better, but if you're not measuring the game against its PlayStation equivalent, then it's a more than worthy entry on this list. Donpachi, published by Atlus, is another vertically scrolling manic shooter for the system, which first saw release in the arcades back in 1995. In this game you can destroy large numbers or chains of enemies in a short period, and build up a number called a combo, similar to the kind found in fighting games. The Sega Saturn really does deliver a slice of shooter heaven to the system's consumers. Silhouette Mirage is a 1997 side-scrolling platformer developed by Treasure. Like most games from this great publisher, the title presents a number of unique elements. The game works with the concept of two attributes which, if a figure is inflicted by an attack whose attribute differs from it, it suffers power damage and has its spirit absorbed when inflicted by the same type attacks. Overall, a very unique game. X-Men vs Street Fighter only received a Sega Saturn port of the game over in Japan. Released in 1997, the port utilised the Saturn's 4MB RAM cartridge peripheral, which was packaged alongside the game, to deliver an arcade-perfect conversion. Due to this, the Saturn version of the game is leagues superior to that of which can be experienced on the Sony PlayStation. In terms of gameplay, the game builds on elements first established in X-Men Children of the Atom, another fighter you can also procure for the Saturn. 1994 saw the release of LODERUNNER, The Legend Returns, which was published by Sierra Online. Like in the original LODERUNNER game, the title takes place in a single frame, with many different elements such as ground, ladders, treasure, items and villains. The goal is to collect all the treasures, avoiding touching any of the monks and reaching the exit. Enemies can be avoided by digging traps in which they can fall into. This is an extremely simplistic game, but a very addictive one nonetheless. The compilation disc for the Saturn, known as 3 Wonders, contains 3 arcade games by Capcom. The best of these is, in my opinion, Midnight Wanderer's Quest for the Chariot, a platform game that sees the player control a hobbit named Lou and his travelling companion Siva. In this game you can run, climb and shoot at enemies. In some ways the game reminds me quite a lot of Nightmare Busters for the Super Nintendo. Midnight Wanderers is a fun run and gun platformer, but it is hard as a bloody nails. The first Dead or Alive game came out on the Sega Saturn, however only in Japan. This is another decent 3D fighting game, amongst many which are available for the system. This Tecmo title was ported to the device in 1997 and differs from other fighters in that in place of a guard button, the game uses a hold button, which causes the fighter to grab their opponent's limbs if they are attacking. This countering system was the first in the fighting genre to utilise different commands that correspond to each type of attack. There are 2 Thunder Force Gold Packs available for the Sega Saturn, each of which featured 2 different older Thunder Force games on compilation discs. As mentioned previously, Thunder Force is a great little series of games, and the franchise's roots can be experienced on the Sega Saturn by using this means of play. These discs are both more than welcome additions to the platform's library. King of Fighters 97 saw a late release on the Sega Saturn in Japan of 1998. This entry in the series introduced 2 unique playstyles, which come in handy when selecting your team. These options are Advanced and Extra. Advanced mode is based on the previous game in the series, King of Fighters 96, but features a revamped power gauge. whilst Extra Mode offers a more traditional playstyle. As expected with the Saturn, this is another quality 2D fighting experience. Daytona USA Circuit Edition is one of 3 variants of Daytona USA for the Saturn. This version of the game is obviously exclusive to Japan, hence its appearance on this list. To quote SegaRetro.org, Circuit Edition extends the draw distance even further, swaps some textures, and allows the user to set the time of day in which the race is in, whether that be night, dusk or morning. On top of this, the arcade soundtrack is now an option, and new drift mechanics have been implemented, making the game controls more similarly to the original arcade version. Daytona Twinbee Yahoo! Deluxe Pack is a compilation of Twinbee games for the Sega Saturn. These Konami Q-em-ups are horizontally scrolling in nature, and the basic fun featuring bright colourful graphics. The games are very pick up and play and highly enjoyable. Another compilation disc for the platform features another 2 scrolling shooters, these being both Image Fight and X Multiply. Games which are in my opinion a lot more challenging than many of the other shooters which I've talked about on this list, and the shooter genre is notoriously difficult anyway. This is another must-have double pack for the Saturn. Zero Divide: The Final Conflict is an extremely bizarre 3D fighter for the platform. In this strange 1997 game, published and developed by Zoom, you can choose from a number of members from an extremely colourful roster, involving all sorts of cyborgs and other futuristic beasts. The sound and music is very atmospheric, and being able to knock parts of your opponent's armour off as you progress is a very satisfying touch. Vampire Saviour, also known as Darkstalkers 3, is another almost arcade-perfect conversion for the Saturn, which takes advantage of the expansion cartridge. Also by Capcom, the game is arguably more skill-based than X-Men vs Street Fighter, which was released in a similar time frame. Characters within the game can perform regular moves, super moves, and the newly introduced to the series, EX attacks. Shining Force 3 Scenario 3, as the name suggests, is the 3rd Shining Force title in the Shining Force 3 trilogy. Chronologically, the game takes place during the events of Scenario 1 and 2, but begins approximately 60% into Scenario 2, if that makes any sense. In this game, you take control of another set of characters from within the Shining Force 3 trilogy, tying the whole thing together. Dungeons and Dragons Collection is a 2-disc set composing of ports of Dungeons and Dragons arcade games known as Tower of Doom and The Shadow over Mystaria. These games with beat-em-up elements never saw a release of the system until all the way up in 1999, a time period in which the Sega Saturn had already been forgotten about in the West altogether. Guardian Force by success differs from other horizontally scrolling shooters in the fact that you play as a tank, which, apart from being able to control which direction it travels in, you can additionally control which direction your vehicle fires in as well. This 1998 arcade port is extremely intuitive in terms of mechanics and features enough changes to stand out greatly from other shooters within this list, so give this one a play. Samurai Showdown 4, Amakusa's Revenge, released in the arcade in 1996, debuted on the Saturn in 1997. The game lacks depth compared to some of the other fighters featured in this video, but for the very same reason, the game is even easier to pick up and play than some of the other fighting entries featured here. The stages and character animations within this game are both a thing of beauty. DODONPACHI by Atlus is the sequel to Donpachi and saw a release in 1997. DODONPACHI is generally known for introducing new gameplay elements whilst improving or changing existing ones. Another absolutely excellent shooter which all Saturn owners should add to their selection of games. The 1996 game Battle Gregor was ported over to the Saturn in 1998. The game features a World War II-like aesthetic, which is a nice change-up from the overwhelming amount of space-themed shooters which are available to play out there. Battle Gregor is a quintessential Japanese Saturn game. Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter is the sequel to X-Men vs Street Fighter and was ported to the Saturn in 1998. The game's aesthetics remain similar to the predecessor, however, the majority of X-Men from the previous game are replaced with fighters from other elements of the Marvel Universe. The variable assist mechanic is introduced to the series in this entry too. Once again, this version of the game outdoes its PlayStation counterpart in every way. WAKU WAKU 7 by Sunsoft, originally released on the Neo Geo MVS hardware, made its way over to the Saturn in 1997. This is yet another beautiful fluid fighter that is supported by the 1MB cartridge expansion. This vibrant looking title features a perfect concoction of rich colours and weird characters. Underneath all the goofy graphics is a really solid fighting game for you to try out and explore. The 1990 arcade game Gun Frontier was ported to the Saturn in 1997, and despite the title's age, the game could hold its own ground against many other vertical scrolling shooters on this list. This title adventure is the last of many shooters I have featured on here. The Japanese Sega Saturn is packed to the brim with great games from this genre. POLICENAUTS is a graphic adventure game published by KONAMI and written and directed by the legendary Hideo Kojima of Metal Gear Solid fame. Many would put the game on par in terms of quality with another Kojima game, with that of course being Snatcher for the Mega CD. POLICENAUTS has never really ever received the same level of notoriety, mainly due to the fact that the whole game was in Japanese with no translation. However, in 2019 we can now easily obtain fan translations to experience this hidden classic in all of its glory. Many would say this title is even better than Snatcher. The final game on this list falls into a similar category to that of POLICENAUTS, in that it has only become accessible due to a fan translation. Dragon Force is one of the most popular games on the whole Saturn platform, and now we can experience this game's sequel in the English language. Dragon Force 2 is a great real-time strategy game and one of the biggest absentees within the Western Saturn's library. Thank the Lord for modern innovations that now open up games like this to everyone. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was my list of the top 50 Japan-only Sega Saturn games. I am pretty sure that many of you in the comment section can probably suggest even more great Japanese Saturn games for all of us to play and enjoy. So let me know what you think I missed out on within the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you want to learn even more about obscure gaming history, then be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell for brand new content every single week. Finally, my channel TOPAC Gaming Man is funded by the fantastic support I receive from my amazing Patreon benefactors. So shoutouts to Carl Johnson, Shizuka Kobayashi, JD Robbins, Greg Hooper, Lawrence C, Since Spaces, Kevin Fahaley, Andrew Bazansky, Edward O'Reilly, Tom Elliott, Mark S. Hines, The Gaming Muso, Quang DX, SpongeMat B, Michael Baker, and all of my other patrons. Thank you. Let's push forward.